How livable are India's cities? Not much, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit Global Liveability Index of 2022. Only 5 Indian cities, Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, Ahmedabad and Bengaluru, make it to the list of 173 cities ranked globally. And they all fared quite poorly, ranking between 140 and 146. But we don't need data to tell us that. Most of us can feel the crunch of infrastructure, affordable housing, rising traffic and air pollution. So today on the Property Show, we get to the crux of what do we do to ensure cities get their due and citizens get a decent quality of life. Now, a recent report by RBI on finances of municipal corporations which are entrusted with the task of providing essential services to citizens brings into focus exactly that. Let's start with some startling facts. At independence, which is 1947, only 17% of Indians lived in cities. India's population was at that time around 39 crore people, which means about 6.5 crore Indians lived in cities. Today, in 2022, India has the second largest urban community in the world, and 34% of Indians, or almost 50 crore out of 140 crore, live in cities. And this number will rise to 50% by 2050. Now the most important data. Even though cities occupy only 3% of the country's land area, they contribute to 60% of the nation's GDP. They are, as we all know, the nation's growth engines. Yet, when it comes to what is spent on cities to provide services like water, sanitation, health, roads, infrastructure, the number is dismally low. RBI report says only 1% of our GDP is spent on providing essential services by municipal corporations to people living here. And this number has been stagnant for over a decade. In fact, to quote the report, there's been no distinct rise in overall municipal revenue in India, which remained broadly unchanged from 1946-47 to date. Now, this is a cause of worry as pointed out by the report. So, how do municipal corporations or urban local bodies raise or find more money to spend and spend it efficiently on improving the livability of our cities? Joining me for today's discussion with a focus on this extensive report, which of course also talks about alternate ways of financing our urban local bodies, we have with us Srikanth Viswanathan, CEO, Janaagraha Centre to Citizenship and Democracy. We also have with us Arindam Guha, Partner, Government and Public Services, Leader, Deloitte, and Abhay Kantak, he is Director, Consulting, CRISIL Market Intelligence and Analytics. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. And my first question will be to Srikanth, because Janaagraha does just that, deep dive into cities all the time. Let me just ask you straightforward, nothing in the RBI report is not known or not spoken about. But Srikanth, just to read it in black and white, that only 1% of India's GDP goes to its cities. And look at even countries like Brazil and South Africa, 7.5% and 6% of GDP is going into these countries' cities. So what's happening here? Why is that number so low and continues to remain so dismal?
Manisha, we'll need to unpack the numbers a little more carefully for us to ascertain the facts behind the number, because the level of devolution of functions in countries like South Africa and Brazil are also significantly better. So their cities have far greater degrees of autonomy. But setting that aside, setting that potential asymmetry aside, the fact remains that India has to invest significantly more amounts of money into our cities. But we must also admit that in the last 7 years or so, there has been a significant increase in investments in urban infrastructure and service delivery, both at the union level and potentially even at state levels. We are beginning to see that urban is slowly but surely becoming a political agenda as well. The pace of change has to increase, the amount of capital has to increase. But I do believe, from our experience of working with a few state governments and cities, that in addition to pumping in more capital in urban infrastructure and services, we've reached a point where any further increase in capital will help only if there are better state capacities that are built, which essentially means the ability of states and cities to take greater amounts of capital and convert them into citizen outcomes. So we need greater attention being paid to both. the amount of capital and state capacities that is able to convert that capital into citizen outcomes.
Srikanth, I'm just so happy to hear, because every time we've done this debate, or at least, about a couple of years ago when we did this debate, from then to now, there's definite change in your enthusiasm for what's happening, the political will that you see both at centre and state for our cities. Now, 2 or 3 key points for my audience. Let me just talk to them about what RBI report has highlighted. One is, they've said that you have to develop a vibrant municipal bond market to provide a boost to the municipal finances in India. They also talk about property tax and say, as that is the most important part of municipal finances, you need to make property taxes and its collection far more efficient. And they also talk about something quite revolutionary, or I wouldn't even say revolutionary, but the fact that some amount of GST can probably be allocated to cities and municipal corporations. Arindam, let me come to you. Positive that we have more attention, but the fact remains that capital itself is simply not enough, and attention is not getting at the capital.
That's right. You see, the main issue here is that, as Srikanth pointed out, cities have limited autonomy in our country. Even to borrow money, they need state government permission. And there are 2 or 3 state governments which has made this permission rule-based. In all other cases, cities have to go back to the state governments, even to raise municipal bonds. And the decision-making process is a bit different in every state. Now, be that as it may, as we have seen, the municipal bond market has seen quite a bit of vibrancy over the last 3-4 years, and there are some reasons underlying that. One is, of course, the SEBI guidelines, governing municipal bond issuance. They were simplified in 2019. Certain procedural delays around getting the need to compulsorily get state government guarantees, or the need to have an independent validator of detailed project reports, these were done away with. So that definitely simplified the process. The second issue which has led to this is that, as part of various central government schemes like Amrut, etc., multiple city corporations have updated their accounts, and they are in a much better position in terms of their financial preparedness. Many of them have also got their ratings done by rating agencies. So I think that makes them better prepared to access extra government sources, extra budgetary sources like municipal bonds. But we do have a lot of ground to cover still, because you see instruments like municipal bonds will only remain attractive as long as they are cost effective vis-a-vis bank borrowings, because these are alternate channels of mobilizing resources.
Absolutely.
And I think there is significant upside there, because very recently we have had the government notification around sovereign green bonds. Many of our city level projects for which resources are being raised, like water recycling, for example, qualify as a green project, as they call it. So I think there is further opportunity to reduce the cost of borrowing by categorizing some of these projects as green projects, and also diversifying into new areas like urban afforestation, etc.
Abhay, would you agree that, if you were to see 10 years ago to now, be it smart cities, be it specific projects like Amrit, but there are definitely many more municipal corporations which have put their act together and can hit the market. They have that level of transparency and accounting norms. Or are we celebrating this a little too early?
Yeah, what Arindam talked about is the simplification of the regulatory reforms for allowing municipal corporations to access the capital market. But I think fundamentally what we need to look at is, you can have a municipal bond, but do you have the capacity to repay those debt obligations? If you look at a macro picture, the average per capita revenue for a local body in a country is around 4,400 per capita. And if you look at the O&M expenditure obligations, typically for a city, excluding urban transport, a city would require around 6,000 to 7,000 rupees per capita. So structurally, they are not in a position to have a surplus to service those bond obligations. So we need to strengthen the municipal revenue base for making them in a position to tap the capital market. So this fundamental issue needs to be rectified first, in my opinion.
Okay. Srikanth, on the revenue base. So let's talk about the user charges and of course property tax, which happens to be the largest base for any municipal corporation. You know, it's always a catch-22 situation, isn't it? I mean, how much do you really charge citizens? And if you do charge, you lose the popular vote. How do you get to the point where you do have levy the right charges, but also keep cities equitable?
That's a great question, Manisha. I think whether you speak about municipal bonds or property taxes and user charges, I think we'll need to recognize that India's cities fall into different buckets. We have few very large cities, say cities with population of 4 million plus. Then you have cities which are in the range of 500,000 to 4 million. And then you have a long tail of smaller cities, about close to 4,000 cities which have a population of less than 100,000. One size does not fit all, right? So the larger cities have greater capabilities to issue municipal bonds, to repay and service those bonds, and even to undertake property tax and fees and user charges reforms. Whereas the long tail of smaller cities do not. They may not even have revenue potential. Forget the ability to realize that potential. So the first point really is we will need different strokes for different folks. These 2 or 3 categories of cities or 3 or 4 categories of cities will have to be treated differently. Secondly, I do believe that property tax needs to be looked at more closely, and we need to break away from the traditional wisdom and repeat the recommendation ad nauseum. Our estimates, after having looked at 1,000-odd cities and projecting that to the entire universe, is that the entire property tax uptake in India is unlikely to exceed 20,000 crores across 4,500 cities. So from this, if you take away the larger cities of Delhi, Bangalore, Mumbai, Hyderabad, Chennai, Ahmedabad, Pune, etc., then you're left with a very small amount of money that's coming from many of the other cities. And it's hard to believe that this is only because of collection efficiency. A lot of this has to do with inherent issues with valuation, etc., which we cannot reform overnight. Because think of a reasonable increment which can happen on this 20,000 crores over the years. You can't make drastic increases year on year. So I think property tax, my own hypothesis is, will have to be on the slow lane, particularly in the medium-sized and smaller cities. The larger cities can afford to undertake some fundamental reforms, but there are political economy issues around it.
Okay. Arindam, what's your view on that? I mean, there is another bold suggestion in the RBI report. Why not allocate, some percentage of GST collected to cities? But here we are talking about a situation that, despite all that has been set out in the 15th Finance Commission in terms of what centre will give, what state will give to cities, really cities are starved. I mean, it's not as if municipal corporations get the funds that they're supposed to get easily at all.
Yeah, you see, there are certain anomalies which are definitely there. For example, you were referring to the 15th Finance Commission. If we look at the local body grants which have been recommended, 70% of those grants, or maybe 65%, have been allocated to rural local bodies, not the cities.
Yes.
So
right
I think these are, whereas we have been discussing that cities are fast emerging as the economic growth centers of the economy. So there are these anomalies which need to be addressed. But I think the issue really is that there are also some potential sources of revenues which are getting ignored by the cities, and that's simply because of lack of capacity. Mm-hmm. For example, land and property, which is there with the municipal corporations or the urban local bodies. Various techniques of land value capture, while they have been successfully tried out in the larger cities, I think the smaller cities, the municipalities in particular, do not have requisite capacity to really put those instruments in place and mobilize resources through public-private partnerships. So it's also a question of capacity. It's a question of adequate support from the state government level to overcome those capacity constraints, because cities really are sitting on resources which can be leveraged much better to mobilize own revenues or own sources of funding.
I would so agree with that, but even in large cities, I have not seen that value capturing coming across so easily. I mean, most smart cities as well, who've done successfully or done very well on other parameters, are struggling to monetize land. There's just so much politics around every piece of land which can be monetized. Abhay, what's your view in terms of just overall, link capacity? It's so closely linked to what you can do in terms of revenue generation, efficiencies, service provision, and really if you don't have the capacity and you cannot implement, even collection of user charges is going to be a hard task, and then you can't raise the finances. So it seems to be like a chicken and an egg situation, but how do we break it? Is there any simple way that CRISIL has looked at in terms of how we can monetize better? Urban local bodies can monetize better?
Yeah, I think what Srikanth said about property tax, the potential is definitely pretty large. And a vibrant or a very well developed or an effective property tax administration is just not about revenue collection, but it's also about vibrancy of a city government. Finally, what cities are serving is how many properties are added. You need to provide them a water supply connection, collect garbage from there, provide them other services. So clearly from a KYC equivalent, cities need to know how many properties do they have. And that coverage aspect is not getting covered fully. And that is the result why there is lack of optimization of property tax revenues.
All right, gentlemen, I'm afraid we've run out of time. We've just really touched the surface of this large issue, but the reason for this conversation is that we need to turn attention on municipal corporation revenues, user charges, and making them more buoyant so that our cities become more livable. Srikanth, Arindam and Abhay, thank you very much for joining me for today's discussion. When we return, we look at a new app, Index Tap, which makes buying and renting of homes so much easier, scientific and data-driven. Stay with me.